Victor Shaw married Samira Williams as part of a deal, but when secrets unravel and love finds its way into their lives, what started as revenge turns into a fight for truth, redemption, and trust. Can two unlikely hearts build a future on what began as a lie? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Victor Shaw stood at the window of his penthouse office, looking down at the city below. At 40 years old, he had everything money could buy, but something was missing. His assistant knocked on the door, bringing in the guest list for tonight's charity gala. As he scanned the names of New York's elite, his mind wandered back to that day 5 years ago, the day he made the biggest mistake of his life. Back then, he had been just as rich, but twice as arrogant. He remembered walking into his kitchen late one night and finding Samira Williams, his maid, cleaning up after one of his parties. There was something about her that night. Maybe it was the way she carried herself with such quiet dignity, or maybe it was just his ego talking. Either way, he had made a clumsy pass at her, expecting her to be flattered by his attention. "Mr. Shaw," she had said, taking a step back, "I think you've had too much to drink. Why don't you get some rest?" Her voice was kind but firm, and that kindness had somehow made it worse. The next day, he fired her, telling himself it was because she wasn't doing a good job, but deep down he knew the truth. His pride couldn't handle the rejection. "The gala starts at 8, Mr. Shaw," his assistant reminded him, bringing him back to the present. "The Children's Hospital Board is expecting you to make a substantial donation." Victor straightened his tie and nodded. These events were all the same. Rich people pretending to care about causes just to see their names in the society pages. But tonight would turn out very different from what he expected. The ballroom of the Plaza Hotel was decorated with crystal, chandeliers and white roses. Victor made his usual rounds, shaking hands and making small talk with people he barely remembered from one event to the next. That's when he saw her. Samira was wearing a catering company uniform, serving champagne to guests. She looked exactly the same, elegant even in the simple black and white outfit, her hair pulled back neatly, her movements graceful. For a moment, Victor felt like he was back in his kitchen 5 years ago, feeling the sting of her gentle rejection. He watched her throughout the evening, memories of his humiliation mixing with something else, a need to prove himself, to show her he had power over her life. When he asked one of the catering staff about her, they told him she was working 2 jobs to support her family. Her mother was sick, and the medical bills were piling up. That's when the idea hit him. It wasn't a nice idea. It came from that dark place inside him where his wounded pride still lived. He would offer her a deal she couldn't refuse, marry him, and he'd take care of all her family's problems. In his mind, it was perfect revenge. She would have to say yes, and this time, he would be the one in control. After the gala, he waited, by the service entrance. When Samira came out, she stopped short at the sight of him. "Mr. Shaw," she said, and he noticed she still had that same quiet strength in her voice. "Miss Williams," he replied, trying to sound casual. "It's been a while." 5 years, she said. "Was there something you needed?" Victor smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. "Actually, I have a business proposition for you. Would you join me for coffee?" At the all-night diner across the street, Victor laid out his offer. He would pay all her mother's medical bills, set up a trust fund for her family, make sure they never wanted for anything again. All she had to do was marry him. "Why would you want to marry me?" Samira asked, her eyes studying his face carefully. "Let's just say I've learned to appreciate what I once took for granted," he said smoothly. But they both knew it was a lie. Samira was quiet for a long time, stirring her coffee. Finally, she looked up at him. "I'll need time to think about it." "You have until tomorrow," Victor said, sliding his business card across the table. "Call me with your answer." As he watched her leave the diner, Victor felt triumphant. He was sure she would say yes. She had to, for her family's sake. What he didn't know was that Samira had a secret of her own, one that would turn his perfect plan upside down. The next morning his phone rang. It was Samira. "I accept your offer," she said, her voice steady. but I have conditions of my own." Victor laughed. "You're not really in a position to make demands." "I think you'll find that I am," she replied. "Meet me for dinner tonight and we'll discuss them." Something in her voice made Victor uneasy, but his pride wouldn't let him back down now. "Fine. 8 o'clock at Le Bernardin." As he hung up the phone, Victor told himself this was all going according to plan. He was finally going to even the score with the woman who had wounded his ego all those years ago. But life has a way of teaching the proudest people the hardest lessons, and Victor Shaw was about to learn that some games have unexpected rules. Le Bernardin was exactly the kind of restaurant Victor Shaw liked to use to impress people, all crystal glasses and white tablecloths. He arrived early and watched Samira walk in, noticing how the maitre d' almost didn't want to let her pass the door, until Victor waved her over. She was wearing a simple black dress, nothing fancy, but she carried herself like she belonged there. "I took the liberty of ordering wine," Victor said as she sat down, enjoying the way other diners were looking at them, the obvious mismatch of the wealthy businessman and the former maid. "I don't drink," Samira replied quietly, folding her napkin in her lap. "Mr. Shaw, before we discuss my conditions, I want to know exactly what you're offering." Victor leaned back in his chair, feeling confident. "Full medical coverage for your mother, the best doctors, private nursing, if needed. A trust fund for your family that will generate enough income so they never have to worry about money again. A generous monthly allowance for you. All you have to do is marry me and play the part of the devoted wife in public." "And in private?" "In private, we'll lead separate lives. After a year or two, we'll have a quiet divorce and you'll get a very comfortable settlement." He smiled. "It's a good deal, Samira. Better than serving champagne to rich people for the rest of your life." Samira took a sip of water, her face calm. "And why are you really doing this, Mr. Shaw? Is it because you fired me 5 years ago after I turned you down?" Victor's smile slipped a little. "That's ancient history. This is business." "No," Samira said, meeting his eyes. "This is about your ego. You didn't like being rejected by the help, so now you want to prove you can buy me." The waiter arrived with their food, giving Victor a moment to compose himself. When they were alone again, he leaned forward. "Does it matter why I'm doing it? Your mother needs expensive treatments. Your sister wants to go to college. I'm offering you a way to help them." "Yes, it matters," Samira said, "because I want you to know exactly what you're getting into. My first condition is that once we're married, you can't divorce me for at least 5 years." 5 years? Victor almost choked on his wine. "That's ridiculous." "Second condition. I want everything in writing before the wedding. The medical coverage, the trust fund, everything. And it all stays in place, even if you change your mind." Victor studied her face, trying to understand her game. "You seem very concerned about me changing my mind. Why is that?" "Because I have a secret, Mr. Shaw, something that might make you want to back out of this deal. But I won't tell you what it is until after we're married." Victor laughed, but it was an uneasy laugh. "You expect me to agree to that?" "Yes, I do, because your need to win, to prove you can buy me, is greater than your fear of what my secret might be." Samira's voice was still quiet, but there was steel in it now. "Those are my conditions. 5 years of marriage, everything in writing, and my secret stays mine until after the wedding." The waiter came back to clear their plates, and Victor used the interruption to think. She was right about one thing. He did want to win. The thought of backing down now, of letting her walk away again, was unbearable. Besides, how bad could her secret be? "Fine," he said finally. "I'll have my lawyers draw up the papers tomorrow, but I have a condition of my own. We get married within the month. I don't want to drag this out." 2 weeks, Samira countered. "The sooner my mother gets proper medical care, the better." They shook hands across the table like business partners closing a deal. Victor noticed her hand was steady, while his was sweating slightly. As they left the restaurant, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, but his pride wouldn't let him back out now. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of lawyers and paperwork. Victor's friends thought he was crazy, marrying his former maid. The gossip columns had a field day with the story. Some called it a modern Cinderella tale, others hinted at scandal and secrets. Victor told everyone it was love, that he'd realized his mistake in letting her go 5 years ago. Only he and Samira knew the truth, or at least part of it. The wedding was small but expensive, held in Victor's penthouse with only a few guests. Samira wore a simple white dress, no veil. She said, "I do," in that same quiet, dignified voice that had haunted Victor for 5 years. He noticed she didn't seem nervous at all, while his own hands were shaking as he put the ring on her finger. At the reception, Victor watched his new wife talking to her family, her sick mother in a wheelchair, her younger sister taking pictures of everything with wide eyes. He felt a moment of doubt. What was her secret? What had he gotten himself into? Later that night, as they stood in the living room of his penthouse, now their penthouse, Victor poured himself a large drink. "Well, Mrs. Shaw," he said, trying to sound casual, "I believe you have something to tell me." Samira stood by the window, looking out at the city lights. When she turned to face him, her eyes were steady. "Yes, I do. But before I tell you, remember that the papers are signed. Everything is legal and binding." Victor's grip tightened on his glass. "Just tell me." "I'm a transgender woman," Samira said simply. "I transitioned 10 years ago, long before I worked. For you?" The crystal glass slipped from Victor's hand and shattered on the floor. The sound echoed through the penthouse like the breaking of his perfect plan, while Samira watched him with those calm, dignified eyes that had started this whole thing 5 years ago. The broken glass crunched under Victor's expensive shoes as he paced the living room. His face had gone from red to white, then back to red again. "You lied to me," he said, his voice shaking with anger. "I never lied," Samira replied calmly, still standing by the window. "I told you I had a secret. You chose not to ask what it was. This is fraud." Victor grabbed his phone. "I'm calling my lawyer. This marriage isn't legal." "Actually, it is. You can call Robert if you want, but he'll tell you the same thing. I made sure everything was legal before I agreed to this." Samira walked over to the bar and got a cloth to clean up the broken glass. "And remember, you signed those papers. My mother's medical care, my sister's education. It's all legally binding now." Victor watched her cleaning up his mess, just like she used to do when she was his maid. But everything was different now. Was this all some kind of revenge? Make me marry you, then drop this bomb? Not everything is about you. Victor. It was the first time she'd used his first name. "I agreed to this marriage because my family needs help, and you offered it. I kept my secret until after the wedding because I knew you wouldn't understand. Your reaction right now proves I was right." "How am I supposed to react?" He ran his hands through his perfectly styled hair, messing it up. "What am I supposed to tell people?" "You don't have to tell them anything. As far as they know, we're just a normal married couple. Isn't that what you wanted? A wife to show off at parties to make you look good in public?" She stood up, the cloth with broken glass in her hand. "That hasn't changed." The next morning, Victor woke up on the couch with a hangover and a lot of regret. Samira was in the kitchen making coffee. She had already moved her things into one of the spare bedrooms. "Your secretary called," she said, putting a cup of coffee and some aspirin on the table. "You have a board meeting at 9. Victor looked at his watch and swore. It was already 8:30. "We need to talk about this," he said, grabbing the coffee. "Yes, we do, but right now you need to go to work. We have 5 years to figure this out." At the office, Victor couldn't focus on anything. His assistant kept giving him concerned looks. Everyone expected him to be glowing with newlywed happiness. Instead, he looked like he hadn't slept in days. That evening, when he got home, he found Samira on the phone with the hospital, arranging her mother's transfer to a better facility. She was handling everything efficiently, just like she used to handle his household. "I ordered dinner," she said after hanging up. "I remember you like Italian." They sat at opposite ends of the long dining table, eating in silence. Finally, Victor spoke. "Why didn't you tell me before?" "Would you have married me if I had?" "No," he admitted. "That's why." Samira took a sip of water. "My mother needs a surgery that costs more than I could make in 10 years. My sister got accepted to Colombia but couldn't afford to go. You offered a solution, even if it was for the wrong reasons." "So you used me," Victor said bitterly, "just like you tried to use me." Samira met his eyes. "You wanted to prove you could buy me, to get revenge. For that night, I turned you down. We both had our reasons. The next few weeks were awkward. They barely saw each other during the day. Victor threw himself into work while Samira spent most of her time at the hospital with her mother. But they had to keep up appearances. There were dinner parties to attend, charity events where they had to play the happy couple. To Victor's surprise, Samira was perfect at these events. She was elegant, charming, and people genuinely liked her. She remembered everyone's names, asked about their children, showed interest in their charity projects. More than once he heard people say what a perfect match they were, but at home they lived separate lives. Victor started noticing little things: how Samira always made sure there was fresh coffee in the morning, how she remembered which shirt he liked to wear for important meetings, how she never complained about his late nights at the office or his bad moods. One night, about a month after the wedding, Victor came home to find Samira crying in the kitchen. It was the first time he'd seen her lose her composure. "What's wrong?" he asked, surprised by his own concern. "My mother's surgery went well," she said, wiping her eyes. "The doctor said if we'd waited much longer, it would have been too late. She's going to be okay." Victor stood there awkwardly, not sure what to do. Part of him was still angry about her secret, about feeling tricked, but another part of him admired her strength, her willingness to do whatever it took to save her mother. "I'm glad," he said finally. "About your mother." Samira looked up at him, really looked at him for the first time since their wedding night. "Thank you. Not just for saying that, but for everything. I know this isn't what you wanted." "Is it what you wanted?" "No," she admitted. "But sometimes life doesn't give us what we want. Sometimes it gives us what we need instead." That night, lying in his bed, Victor thought about her words. He had wanted revenge, wanted to prove he could control her. Instead, he'd gotten a lesson in courage and sacrifice. He still didn't understand everything about Samira's life, her choices, but for the first time, he wanted to try. 2 months into their marriage, things started to change. Not in big ways at first, but in small moments. That added up. It started when Victor's mother, Eleanor Shaw, decided to pay them a surprise visit. "I can't believe you've been married for 2 months, and I haven't even had dinner with my new daughter-in-law," Eleanor announced, walking into the penthouse like she owned it. She was dressed head to toe in designer clothes, her silver hair perfectly styled. Victor nearly choked on his morning coffee. "Mother, this isn't a good time." "Nonsense," Eleanor said, looking around the penthouse with critical eyes. "I'm taking Samira shopping, then we're having dinner together, as a family." Before Victor could object, Samira walked in from her morning run. She was wearing workout clothes, her hair pulled back in a ponytail. "Mrs. Shaw," she said, surprised but composed. "Welcome to our home." Eleanor looked Samira up and down, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Well, we certainly need to do something about your wardrobe. If you're going to be a Shaw, you need to dress like one." Victor started to say something, but Samira cut him off. "Thank you, Mrs. Shaw. I'd love to get your advice on shopping. Just let me shower and change first." When Samira left the room, Eleanor turned to Victor. "Really, darling, I know you think you're in love, but couldn't you have found someone more suitable? Everyone at the club is talking. Let them talk," Victor said, surprising himself with how defensive he felt. "Samira is my wife now." The shopping trip was a disaster. Eleanor took them to the most expensive stores in New York, treating Samira like a dress-up doll. She made comments about Samira's height, her shoulders, her hands. Victor, who had insisted on coming along, watched as Samira handled each subtle insult with grace. "You know," Eleanor said in one store, loud enough for others to hear, "with the right clothes and some good jewelry, we might almost be able to hide your common background." Victor saw something flash in Samira's eyes, not anger but hurt. For the first time, he realized how much strength it took for her to face this kind of judgment every day. "Mother," he said sharply, "that's enough." Eleanor looked shocked. Victor had never talked back to her before. "I'm only trying to help." "No, you're trying to be cruel," Victor said, "and I won't allow it. Samira is my wife, and you will treat her with respect." The store went quiet. Eleanor's face turned red. "Well," she said, picking up her designer purse, "I can see this was a mistake. Call me when you've come to your senses." She walked out, leaving them alone among the racks of expensive clothes. "You didn't have to do that," Samira said quietly. "Yes, I did." Victor looked at her, really looked at her, maybe for the first time. "I'm sorry for how she treated you, for how I've treated you." That night, they had dinner alone in the penthouse. Samira cooked, something she hadn't done since they got married. Victor watched her move around the kitchen, thinking about how much he still didn't know about her. "Tell me about your family," he said as they ate. "The real story, not what's in the background check my lawyers did." Samira was quiet for a moment. "My father left when I told them who I really was. My mother took time to understand, but she loved me enough to try. It wasn't easy for her, especially in our community, but she stood by me. That's why I'd do anything to help her now. And your sister, Angela was just 12 then. She never had a problem with it. She just wanted her sibling to be happy." Samira smiled at the memory. "She's the one who helped me choose the name Samira." Victor thought about his own family, about his mother's prejudices, about the way he'd been raised to care more about appearances than truth. "I've never met anyone as brave as you," he said suddenly. Samira looked surprised. "I'm not brave. I'm just living my life the only way I know how." The next day at work, Victor's assistant brought him the society pages. There was a picture of them at the store with Eleanor walking out in the background. The caption read, "Trouble in Paradise, Shaw family drama unfolds in public." Victor was about to throw the paper away when he noticed something in the picture he hadn't seen in person, the way he was standing slightly in front of Samira like he was protecting her. When had that happened? When had his instinct shifted from wanting to hurt her to wanting to shield her? That evening, he had dinner with his old friend James, who ran another company. "You've changed," James said, studying him over their steaks. "What do you mean?" "You stood up to your mother. You defend your wife in public. The old Victor Shaw would never have done that. He was too worried about what people thought." Victor took a sip of his wine, thinking about it. "Maybe I needed to change. Is it true?" James lowered his voice. "What they're saying at the club about Samira." Victor felt his jaw tighten. "What exactly are they saying?" "You know, about her past, about who she used to be." Victor stood up, throwing his napkin on the table. "My wife's past is nobody's business but her own. And if I hear you or anyone else at the club talking about her again, you'll regret it." He left the restaurant without finishing his dinner. On the drive home, he realized James was right. He had changed. The question was, what was he going to do about it? When he got home, Samira was in the living room reading a book. She looked up when he came in. "You're home early. We need to talk," he said, sitting down across from her. "About us, about this marriage, about everything." Samira put her book down and faced Victor. The city lights twinkled behind her, through the penthouse windows. "What do you want to talk about?" "Everything," Victor said, loosening his tie. "I've been thinking about why I really asked you to marry me. It wasn't just about getting revenge for that night you turned me down. It was about control, about proving I could buy anything or anyone I wanted." "I know," Samira said quietly. "You're not as complicated as you think you are, Victor." He almost smiled at that. "No, I guess I'm not, but you are. You're the strongest person I've ever met, and I've spent 2 months trying not to see that. Just..." Then Victor's phone rang. It was his mother. He looked at the screen for a moment, then turned the phone off completely. This conversation was more important. "Today at the restaurant," he continued, "my friend James started asking questions. About you, about your past. And for the first time I wasn't angry because I felt tricked. I was angry because they were trying to hurt you." Samira watched him carefully. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I'm sorry for everything, for how I treated you 5 years ago, for trying to get revenge, for how I reacted on our wedding night." He ran a hand through his hair. "You deserve better than that." "Victor, let me finish. When my mother was here today, watching her treat you like that, it made me sick, because that's exactly how I've been treating you, like you were something to be fixed or hidden or controlled." Samira stood up and walked to the window. "Do You know why I really turned you down that night 5 years ago? Because I was drunk and crude? No, because you didn't see me. You saw a maid you could impress with your money and power. Just like now, you saw someone you could control with. The contract. She turned to face him. But I've never let anyone control me, not my father when he told me I couldn't be who I am, not the people who said I'd never make it on my own, and not you with your revenge marriage. Victor felt something twist in his chest. Then why did you agree to marry me? Because sometimes you have to work with what life gives you. I needed help for my family, and you needed to prove something to yourself. It was a fair trade. She smiled slightly. But I never planned to let you break me. I'm starting to realize that's impossible, Victor said. Breaking you. They were quiet for a moment, the city humming below them. Then Victor spoke again. I want to start over. What do you mean? I want to try being a real husband, not for show, not for revenge, but because I want to know you. The real you. He stood up and walked over to her. Will you let me try? Samira studied his face. Why should I trust you? Because I'm not asking you to pretend to be someone else. I'm not asking you to change. I'm asking for a chance to change myself. Just then there was a loud knock at the door. It was after midnight. Who could be visiting at this hour? Victor opened the door to find his mother's lawyer, Richard Wells, standing there with a thick envelope. Mr. Shaw, Wells said, his face grim. Your mother asked me to deliver this immediately. She's filing a lawsuit to have your marriage annulled. She claims fraud and coercion. She's also moving to have you removed from the company board, claiming you're mentally unfit to make decisions. Victor felt his world spinning. Everything he'd built, everything he'd worked for was suddenly at risk. But when he looked back at Samira, standing strong and dignified by the window, he knew what he had to do. Tell my mother she's making a mistake, he said firmly. And if she goes through with this, she'll lose her son forever. After Wells left, Samira touched Victor's arm gently. You don't have to do this. We can end the marriage now before you lose everything. Victor turned to her. 5 years ago, I fired you because my pride was hurt. Tonight, I'm choosing to fight for you because my pride doesn't matter anymore. Something else does. What? The truth. And the truth is, I'm starting to fall in love with who you really are, not who I tried to make you be. Samira's eyes widened. This wasn't part of their deal. This wasn't part of either of their plans. But sometimes life gives you what you need instead of what you want. I can't promise to love you back, she said honestly. Not yet, but I can promise to give you a chance to prove you mean what you say. Victor nodded. That's all I'm asking for. A chance to show you the man I want to be instead of the man I was. As they stood there in the midnight quiet, both of them knew everything had changed. The marriage that had started as a business deal and an act of revenge had become something else. Something real and fragile and full of possibility. But Eleanor Shaw wasn't going to give up easily. And as they would soon learn, she wasn't the only one who wanted to tear them apart. The morning papers were brutal. Shaw family scandal, screamed the headlines. Pictures of Victor and Samira were everywhere, along with old photos someone had dug up from before her transition. Eleanor Shaw had gone to the press with everything. Victor found Samira in the kitchen, staring at the papers spread across the counter. Her hands were shaking slightly as she made coffee, but her voice was steady. Your mother works fast. I'm so sorry, Victor said, wanting to touch her but not sure if he should. I'll call the lawyers. We can fight this. No. Samira turned to face him. First, we need to deal with your company. The board meeting is in an hour. They'll expect you to have answers. Victor blinked. With everything happening, he'd almost forgotten about the emergency board meeting. How did you know about that? Your assistant called earlier. I told her you'd be there. Samira handed him a cup of coffee. Your blue suit is pressed and ready. It's the one that makes you look most authoritative. Even now, she was thinking about helping him. Victor felt ashamed of how long it had taken him to see her true worth. Come with me, he said suddenly. What? To the board meeting. You're my wife. Let's face them together. The Shaw Industries boardroom was packed when they arrived. Eleanor sat at one end of the long table, looking smug. The other board members wouldn't meet Victor's eyes as he and Samira walked in. Well, Eleanor said. "I suppose this proves my point about your mental state. Bringing her here at a time like this?" Victor helped Samira to a seat, then stood at the head of the table. "I'm only going to say this once. My marriage is not up for discussion. My wife is not up for discussion. Anyone who has a problem with that can sell their shares and leave." "Don't be naive," Eleanor snapped. "This scandal could ruin the company. Our stocks are already dropping." "Then let them drop." Victor's voice was firm. "I've spent my whole life caring more about this company's reputation than about being a decent human being." "That ends today." One of the older board members, George Peterson, cleared his throat. "Victor, your mother has raised some serious concerns. Perhaps if you agreed to a quiet divorce—" "Mr. Peterson," Samira spoke up for the first time, her voice clear and strong. "How long have you known my husband?" 20 years, George said, surprised. "I worked with his father. And in those 20 years, when have you ever seen him stand up for something he believes in, regardless of the cost?" She looked around the table. "You all know Victor as a businessman who always puts profit first. If he's willing to risk everything for this marriage, shouldn't that tell you something?" The room went quiet. Even Eleanor seemed thrown by Samira's words. "The lawsuit is a waste of time," Victor continued. "Our marriage is legal. The company bylaws don't give you the power to remove me without cause. So here's what's going to happen. My mother will withdraw her lawsuit and resign from the board, or I'll call for a vote to remove her." "You wouldn't dare," Eleanor gasped. "I'm your mother. A mother who's trying to destroy her son's marriage for the sake of appearances." Victor's voice cracked slightly. "Choose carefully, mother, because this is your last chance to be part of my life." Later that night, back at the penthouse, Samira found Victor on the balcony. The board meeting had ended with Eleanor storming out, but not before promising this wasn't over. "Are you okay?" Samira asked softly. "No," Victor admitted. "I just cut ties with my mother. Half the board thinks I'm crazy. Our stock price dropped 15% today." He turned to look at her. "But I've never felt more sure about anything in my life." "Why?" "Because for the first time I'm fighting for something real." He reached for her hand, and this time she let him take it. "When I saw those old photos in the paper, I was angry. Not because of what they showed, but because they were trying to hurt you. Trying to shame you for being brave enough to become who you really are." Samira squeezed his hand. "Those photos are part of my past. I'm not ashamed of them. They show how far I've come." "You're amazing," Victor said quietly. "Do you know that? Everything my mother threw at you today, everything the press is saying, and you're still standing strong." "I've had a lot of practice standing strong," Samira said. "But I have to admit, it's nice not to have to do it alone for once." Just then, Victor's phone buzzed. It was a text from James, his old friend from the restaurant. "Check your email, there's something you need to see." Victor pulled up his email on his phone. What he saw made his blood run cold. "Samira," he said, his voice tight, "I think we have a bigger problem than my mother." "What is it?" "Someone's been going through your past. Deep background checks, interviews with old acquaintances." He looked up at her. "They're trying to find something they can use against us, and I think I know who's behind it." "Who?" "Marcus Reynolds. My biggest competitor. He's been trying to take over Shaw Industries for years." Victor ran a hand through his hair. "This isn't just about our marriage anymore. This is about taking everything away from both of us." Samira straightened her shoulders, that familiar strength showing through. "Then we'll fight him too. Together." Victor looked at his wife, this woman he'd married for all the wrong reasons, who was now standing by him for all the right ones. "Together," he agreed. But as they went back inside, neither of them knew just how dirty this fight was about to get. Marcus Reynolds was a man who played to win, no matter the cost. And he had just found something in Samira's past that could destroy everything. Marcus Reynolds sat in his corner office, smiling at the folder on his desk. At 55, with silver hair and expensive suits, he looked every bit the successful businessman. But there was something cold in his eyes as he reviewed the information his investigators had found. "Are you sure about this?" he asked the private investigator sitting across from him. "Completely sure," the investigator replied. Before her, transition. Samira Williams worked briefly at Memorial Hospital. During that time, there was an incident involving a missing patient and some stolen medications. The police investigated, but nothing was ever proven. Marcus leaned back in his chair. And you think you can get the old case reopened? With the right pressure in the right places? Absolutely. Meanwhile, at Shaw Industries, Victor was in his office when his assistant rushed in. "Mr. Shaw, you need to see this." She handed him a tablet with a breaking news story. "Shaw Industries CEO's wife linked to hospital scandal," the headline read. Victor felt his heart sink as he read further. The article hinted at criminal investigations, missing drugs, and potential arrests. He immediately called Samira. "Have you seen the news?" "I'm looking at it now," she said quietly. "Victor, I need to tell you something. Something I've never told anyone." "Not over the phone," he said, already grabbing his coat. "I'm coming home." When Victor arrived at the penthouse, he found Samira sitting in the living room, looking more vulnerable than he'd ever seen her. She had an old photo album open on her lap. "Before I tell you everything," she said, "I want you to understand something. When you're transgender and trying to transition, especially 10 years ago, getting proper medical care wasn't easy. Many doctors wouldn't help. Insurance wouldn't cover anything." Victor sat down beside her. "Tell me what happened." "I was working as an orderly at Memorial Hospital," Samira began. "There was a patient there, an elderly woman named Maria Garcia. She was dying of cancer, but she was also one of the kindest people I'd ever met. She knew about my struggle, about how I was trying to save money for hormone therapy." Samira's hands trembled as she turned a page in the photo album, revealing a picture of a smiling elderly woman in a hospital bed. "One day, Maria told me she wanted to help. She had access to hormone medications through her cancer treatment. She offered to share them with me." "Did you take them?" Victor asked gently. "No," Samira said firmly. "I couldn't. It wouldn't have been right. But someone else did steal medications from the hospital that week. When they investigated, I was easy suspect. A trans person working minimum wage. They assumed I was desperate enough to steal." "But you were innocent," Victor said. "Yes." Maria tried to tell them that, but she died before the investigation was complete. They never found enough evidence to charge me, but I lost my job. That's when I started working as a maid. Victor took her hand. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" "Because it was humiliating. Being suspected of something I didn't do, losing my job, having to start over. I wanted to forget it ever happened." She looked at him with worried eyes. "Do you believe me?" "Yes," Victor said without hesitation. "I believe you." Just then, Victor's phone rang. It was James again. "Victor, you need to turn on the news. Reynolds just called a press conference." They turned on the TV to see Marcus Reynolds standing at a podium looking grave. "As a longtime competitor of Shaw Industries," he was saying, "I feel it's my duty to raise concerns about the company's leadership. Victor Shaw has not only damaged the company's reputation with his questionable marriage, but his wife has a criminal past that raises serious ethical concerns. He's trying to force a hostile takeover," Victor realized. "If our stock price drops enough because of this scandal, he can buy controlling interest," Samira finished, "and your mother would probably help him do it." Victor's phone started buzzing with messages from board members and shareholders. Everyone wanted answers. The story was spreading fast. "We need to fight back," Victor said, "but I won't let you be dragged through the mud again. There has to be another way." Samira stood up, her strength returning. "Maybe there is. Maria Garcia's family. They might still have her personal effects, her medical records. If we could prove she was trying to help me, that I never took anything." "It was 10 years ago," Victor said gently. "How would we even find them?" "I kept in touch with her daughter for a while after Maria died. She lives in Queens." Samira picked up her phone. "Let me make some calls." While Samira reached out to Maria's family, Victor dealt with the press. He issued a statement standing by his wife and denouncing Reynolds' accusations as baseless attempts at corporate sabotage. But Reynolds wasn't done. That evening, he released more details to the press, including security camera footage from the hospital showing Samira near the medication storage area on the night of the theft. "This looks bad," Victor admitted. as they watched the footage on TV. "I was working that night," Samira explained. "I was supposed to be in that area, but look at the timestamp." Victor looked closer. 10:45 p.m. The medications were stolen at midnight. I was already home by then. The hospital's sign-out logs would prove it. Just then, Samira's phone rang. It was Maria Garcia's daughter, Angela. "I found my mother's journals," she said. "She wrote about everything, including the person who really stole those medications. You need to come see this." Victor and Samira exchanged looks. This could be the evidence they needed to clear her name. But as they grabbed their coats to head to Queens, neither of them knew that Marcus Reynolds had already discovered their lead, and he had sent someone to get to Angela Garcia first. The streets of Queens were dark and wet from a light rain as Victor's car pulled up in front of Angela Garcia's small house. But something wasn't right. The front door was slightly open and lights were flashing inside. "Stay in the car," Victor told Samira, but she was already getting out. "Angela?" Samira called out as they approached the house. "It's Samira Williams." They found Angela Garcia in her living room, frantically picking up scattered papers from the floor. The place had been ransacked. "They were just here," she said, her voice shaking. "Two men. They said they were police officers, but they didn't show badges. They were looking for my mother's journals." "Did they find them?" Samira asked urgently. Angela smiled, a bit of her mother's cleverness showing in her eyes. "No. Mama taught me to be careful with important things. When you called, I put the journals in a safe place." She went to the kitchen and pulled out a loose brick from the wall behind the refrigerator. Inside was a stack of worn notebooks. Mama wrote everything down, every patient she talked to, every medication she took, every visitor she had. As they looked through the journals, Victor kept watch at the window. "We should take these somewhere safe," he said. "Reynolds' men might come back." "Here," Angela said suddenly, pointing to an entry. "October 15th, 10 years ago, the day before the theft?" Samira read aloud. "Today I met with Dr. Harrison again. He's desperate for money to pay his gambling debts. He keeps asking about access to the medication storage room. I told him I may be dying, but I'm not going to help him steal from the hospital." "Dr. James Harrison," Angela explained. "He was my mother's oncologist." Victor was already on his phone, Googling the name. Got him. He lost his medical license 5 years ago for stealing and selling prescription medications. "That's not all," Angela said, turning to another page. "My mother wrote about how he threatened her when she said she'd report him. She was scared, but she wrote everything down anyway. And look at this entry from the night of the theft." The entry described how Dr. Harrison had come to Maria's room at 11:30 p.m., thinking she was asleep. He didn't know she was awake and watched him use her security card to access the medication room at midnight. "This proves you're innocent," Victor said to Samira. "Harrison was the thief, not you." Just then they heard cars pulling up outside. Through the window, they could see Marcus Reynolds himself getting out of a black SUV, along with the two men who had ransacked the house earlier. "Is there a back way out?" Victor asked Angela. "Through the kitchen, but they probably have that covered too." Samira pulled out her phone. "I'm calling the real police." "Wait," Victor said, a plan forming. "I have a better idea." He pulled out his phone and started recording a video. "Mrs. Garcia, would you mind reading these journal entries on camera? And could you show the dates clearly?" Angela nodded, understanding. As she read her mother's words into the camera, Victor was already uploading the video and sending it to every news outlet in the city. He also sent it to a group chat with all Shaw Industries board members. "Reynolds!" he called out through the front door. "I know you're out there. Check your phone. I just sent the video to every major news network in New York. In about 5 minutes, everyone's going to know who really stole those medications." Through the window, they could see Reynolds frantically checking his phone. His face went pale as he watched the video, but they weren't prepared for what happened next. One of Reynolds' men pulled out a gun. "We need those journals," he shouted. "Come out, or we're coming in." That's when they heard another voice, strong, clear, and familiar. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." Eleanor Shaw stepped out of a car that had pulled up quietly during the confrontation. She had a phone to her ear. "Yes, Commissioner," she said loudly. "I'm outside 1242 Maple Street in Queens. Marcus Reynolds and his men are threatening my son and daughter-in-law with a weapon. Please send officers immediately." Reynolds spun around. "Eleanor, what are you doing here?" "Choosing my family over my pride," she said, walking past him to the front door. "Victor, Samira, let me in." When they opened the door, Eleanor walked straight to Samira. "I've been horrible to you," she said simply. "I was wrong. When I saw what Reynolds was trying to do to my son's company, to his marriage, I realized I was just as bad. Worse because I'm his mother. I'm supposed to love him no matter what." Samira looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "Thank you for coming." Police sirens wailed in the distance, getting closer. Reynolds and his men ran for their cars, but they didn't get far. Police cars were already blocking both ends of the street. As they watched Reynolds being handcuffed and put into a police car, Eleanor turned to Victor and Samira. "I've already called an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning. I plan to publicly apologize and withdraw my lawsuit. That is, if you'll let me try to make things right." Victor looked at Samira, who gave him a small nod. "We'd like that," he said, taking his wife's hand. Later that night, back at the penthouse, Victor found Samira on their balcony. The city lights seemed brighter somehow, more hopeful. "How did your mother know where to find us?" Samira asked. Victor smiled. "Apparently, she had her own investigator following Reynolds. When she saw his men ransack Angela's house, she knew we'd show up there eventually. She saved us tonight." "She saved herself too," Victor said, "from becoming someone she didn't want to be." He turned to face his wife. "You know, when I married you, I thought I was going to teach you a lesson. Instead, you taught me and my mother something about courage, about being true to yourself no matter what." Samira looked up at him, her eyes soft in the city lights. "And what about love? Have you learned anything about that?" Instead of answering, Victor kissed her. This time she kissed him back. The morning headlines told a very different story than they had the day before. Reynolds arrested for corporate espionage. Shaw daughter-in-law cleared of all accusations. Mother and son reunited in dramatic standoff. In the Shaw Industries boardroom, Eleanor stood before the board members, her head held high. "I let my prejudices cloud my judgment," she said clearly. "I tried to destroy a marriage because I couldn't see past my own narrow views. I was wrong and I apologize." The board members watched in amazement as Eleanor walked over to Samira and took her hand. "This is my daughter-in-law, and I'm proud to call her family." After the meeting, Victor found Samira in his office, looking out at the city. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Like I can finally breathe," she said. "For the first time in 10 years, that shadow isn't hanging over me anymore." She turned to face him. "But that's not the only reason." "Oh? Last night when you kissed me." She stepped closer to him. "Did you mean it?" "Yes," Victor said simply. "I love you, Samira. Not because of our deal, not because of what we've been through, but because of who you are. I think I love you." "Too," she said softly, "and that terrifies me." "Why?" "Because this wasn't supposed to happen. We were supposed to have a business arrangement. 5 years of marriage, then go our separate ways. Feelings make everything complicated." Victor took her hands in his. "Then let's uncomplicate it. Forget about the contract. Forget about the 5-year deal. What do you want?" Before she could answer, there was a knock at the door. It was Angela Garcia carrying a box. "I found something else in my mother's things," she said. "I think you should have it." Inside the box were more of Maria Garcia's journals, but also photographs, dozens of them, pictures of Maria with her patients, including many with Samira. In one, they were playing cards in Maria's hospital room. In another, they were sharing a laugh over coffee in the hospital cafeteria. "Mama saw something special in you," Angela said to Samira. "She wrote about it in her journals. She said you had the kindest heart of anyone she'd ever met, but also the strongest spirit." Samira wiped tears from her eyes as she looked through the photos. "She was like a second mother to me when my own family struggled to accept me. And now you have another mother who wants to try," Victor said gently, referring to Eleanor. That evening they had dinner at Eleanor's mansion, the first real family dinner since their marriage. Eleanor had gone all out with her best china and fresh flowers everywhere. "I'm not very good at cooking," she admitted as they sat down, "but I'm trying to learn." "Samira, I understand you're an excellent cook. Maybe you could teach me." "I'd like that," Samira said, and she meant it. As they ate, Eleanor asked questions about Samira's family, really listening to the answers this time. She wanted to know about Samira's mother's recovery, about her sister's studies at Columbia. "We should have them over for dinner," Eleanor suggested. "All of us together, a real family gathering." After dinner, Victor and Samira walked in Eleanor's garden. The night was warm and the air was sweet with the scent of roses. "I never thought I'd see my mother change like this," Victor said. "People can surprise you," Samira replied. "I never thought I'd fall in love with a man who tried to buy me for revenge." Victor stopped walking and turned to face her. "About what I asked earlier." "What do you want, Samira?" She looked up at him in the moonlight. "I want to start over. Not as a business arrangement, not as a revenge plot, but as us. Just us." "Then marry me," Victor said. "Again, for real this time." Samira laughed. "We're already married. I mean, let's have another ceremony. One that's about love, not contracts. One where my mother can walk me down the aisle and your mother can walk you down the aisle. One where we say vows we actually mean." Before she could answer, they heard Eleanor calling from the house. When they went inside, they found her watching the news. Marcus Reynolds had made a full confession, admitting to corporate espionage and attempting to frame Samira. The scandal had forced him to resign from his company. "Justice has a way of finding the truth," Eleanor said, turning off the TV. She looked at Victor and Samira standing together. "Just like love has a way of finding the right path, even when we try our best to block it." Later that night, as they drove home to their penthouse, Samira turned to Victor. "Yes," she said. "Yes, what?" "Yes, I'll marry you again. For real this time?" Victor smiled, remembering how different things had been just a few months ago when they'd first made their deal. "I promise to be a better husband this time. And I promise to be a real wife this time," Samira said. "One who loves you for exactly who you are." As they rode up in the elevator to their penthouse, both of them knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges. There would still be people who didn't understand or accept their love. There would still be battles to fight and prejudices to overcome, but now they would face everything together, not because of a contract or a deal, but because they chose each other completely and without conditions. What they didn't know was that their biggest challenge was still to come, one that would test not just their love, but their trust in each other in ways they never expected. 3 months had passed since the night in Eleanor's garden. The preparations for Victor and Samira's second wedding were in full swing. This time everything was different. Eleanor and Samira's mother had become unlikely best friends, spending hours planning every detail together. But fate had one more challenge in store for them. It started with a letter that arrived at the penthouse one morning. The return address was from a prison upstate. When Samira opened it, her hands started shaking. "What is it?" Victor asked, concerned. "It's from my father," Samira said quietly. "He wants to see me." Samira's father had walked out on the family when she first came out as transgender. He hadn't spoken to her in over 10 years. Now he was in prison for fraud, claiming he had changed, and wanted to make amends before their wedding. "You don't have to see him," Victor said, holding her. "I know." Samira stared at the letter. "But maybe I need to, for myself." The prison was cold and grey. Victor insisted on coming with her, but had to wait in the visiting area while a guard escorted Samira to meet her father. Robert Williams looked older, smaller than she remembered. His prison uniform hung loose on his frame. "You look beautiful," he said when he saw her. "Just like your mother." Samira sat down across from him. "Why did you want to see me?" "I saw you in the papers, all that business with Shaw Industries." He shifted uncomfortably. "I've had a lot of time to think in here. About the kind of father I was, the kind of man I was." 10 years, Samira said, her voice tight. 10 years without a word. "I was wrong," he said simply. "I was scared and ignorant and wrong. When you told us who you really were, I couldn't handle it. But being in here losing everything, it makes you see what really matters. Samira stayed quiet, waiting. "I'm getting out next month," he continued. "Good behavior. I was hoping maybe I could come to the wedding." Before Samira could answer, a commotion broke out in the visiting area. She heard Victor shouting her name. When she ran out, she found him grappling with another prisoner, Marcus Reynolds. "You ruined me," Reynolds was screaming as guards pulled him away. "You took everything from me." Later, they learned that Reynolds had bribed a guard to arrange the confrontation. He had been hoping to hurt Victor, to get some revenge before his corporate espionage trial. Back at the penthouse, as the doctor checked Victor's bruised ribs, Samira paced anxiously. "He could have killed you." "I'm fine," Victor insisted. "I'm more worried about you. How did it go with your father?" Samira sat down next to him. "He says he's changed. He wants to come to the wedding." "Do you believe him?" "I don't know." She took Victor's hand. "When I saw you fighting with Reynolds today, I was so scared. It made me realize something." "What?" "That the past doesn't matter as much as the future. My father, Reynolds, all of it. It's just part of what brought us here. But it's not who we are now." The day of the wedding dawned bright and clear. This time they chose the botanical gardens instead of Victor's penthouse. Flowers bloomed everywhere, and the morning sun made everything glow. In one dressing room, Eleanor helped Victor with his tie. "I'm proud of you," she said, straightening his collar. "You've become the man your father always wanted you to be." "No," Victor corrected her gently. "I've become the man Samira helped me be." In another room, Samira stood in her wedding dress, an elegant creation that Eleanor and her mother had helped her choose. There was a knock at the door. It was her father, looking uncertain in a new suit. "Your mother said I could walk you." "Down the aisle," he said. "If you want." Samira looked at him for a long moment. Then she smiled. "I'd like that." The ceremony was everything their first wedding wasn't. When they exchanged vows, there was no mention of contracts or deals. Instead, they spoke from their hearts. "Samira," Victor said, his voice carrying across the garden, "you taught me that real strength isn't about power or money or control. It's about being true to yourself and standing up for love no matter what. I promise to spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of your courage and your heart." Samira's eyes shone with tears as she spoke. "Victor, you taught me that people can change, that love can heal old wounds and build new bridges. I promise to walk beside you for all our days, facing whatever comes together." As they kissed, their families, both sides together, cheered. Eleanor was crying openly, holding hands with Samira's mother. Even Robert Williams had tears in his eyes. At the reception, Victor clinked his glass for everyone's attention. "I want to make an announcement," he said. "Shaw Industries is starting a new foundation. The Maria Garcia Foundation will provide medical support and resources for transgender individuals who need help with their transition." The crowd applauded, but Victor wasn't finished. "And I'm stepping down as CEO." A gasp went through the room. Samira looked at him in surprise. "Don't worry," he smiled. "I'm not leaving the company. I'm just moving to a different role, one that lets me focus on the foundation and on what really matters." He took Samira's hand. "My wife and I will be running the foundation together." Later that night, as they danced, under the stars, Samira leaned close to Victor. "Are you sure about leaving the CEO position?" "Completely sure," he said. "When I married you the first time, I thought I was the one with all the power. I thought I could buy happiness, control love, run everything like a business deal. And now I know that real power is in being vulnerable, in letting love change you, in using what you have to help others." He pulled her closer. "You showed me that." As the music played and their families celebrated around them, Victor and Samira shared a secret smile. Their story had started with revenge and secrets, with pride and prejudice, but it had transformed into something beautiful, a testament to the power of love to change hearts, heal wounds, and build bridges across any divide. The morning headlines would call it a fairy tale ending, but it was more than that. It was a new beginning, not just for them, but for everyone their love would touch through the foundation, and their example, their marriage, which had started as a business deal, had become a force for change. And as they danced under the stars, Both of them knew that this was just the beginning of their real love story. The end.